I would like at the outset to greet my colleagues here at the table, Andrés Malamud, Gerardo Caetano, and to say that for me it's a pleasure to be here today and to exchange some views on integration. So I will try to talk a little bit about how is integration today in South America. Of course, I will talk about Unasur, Mercosur, but I will try also to speak something about the European Union and how we view things in Europe, because things are all connected in the world, and we have to understand that this process is not a process isolated in South America. It has a connection, and I think that we have to understand the connections of all this. I think the first thing I would like to say is that we are this year we are, let's say, commemorating the 60 years of the European Union that will be in the beginning of next year, and also 25 years of Mercosur. But on this commemoration, we would be a party and everybody should be happy because of this. But we stop and think what is happening, what is going on in the European Union and in Mercosur. And what we see is we visualize that we have to celebrate, but with a different taste. We have to celebrate in the middle of a crisis. There is a crisis in the process of integration. This crisis could be deeper or less deeper. This is something that we can discuss. If it's something small or something that we really have to think about. But there is no doubt that there are things that are weakening the process of integration. It's I think the first thing that we have to understand is that both process of integration, they tried to do the same thing. They tried to promote dialogue, coordination, harmonize practices, and also to enhance trade. This is the main target behind, and this was the main motive. But together with that, improve the standard of living of people. This was something very important, and I think that especially the European Union could do that. But also Mercosur could do that too. In what we have now, I think, to understand what's happening is that in integration we have cycles. And we had the first cycle that was the cycle of expansion of integration. And now I think we are on a cycle of questioning. I would not say that it's a point that will not go deep enough anymore. It's simply everybody's questioning. There is a lot of questions inside countries and questions among countries. Now, talking a little bit more about South America. And indeed, I wrote 2 books on this question of South America. It's important for those that are from Europe, and even for those that come from South America, that usually do not think about that. But when South America was conceived, basically we imported the rivalry between Portugal and Spain down there. So it was just one continent, because South America is a continent, but we were looking each other to other sides. We're not looking inwards, we're looking outwards, because on one side there was Portugal, and the other side Spain. The process of formation of the countries are radically the opposite. In the case of the Portuguese portions, in the beginning there were 3 different countries there. One, that's Brazil. The second one was a country formed by the states of Ceará and Piauí. And the third country, Maranhão and the Amazon. Okay? Those 3 countries, in the case of the Portuguese South America, united in one country that's called Brazil. On the other side of the continent, we had initially 3 different countries, let's say, or 3 different units. Those 3 different units, they did not reunite, as in the case of Brazil. They split in 9 different countries. Okay? So we had a completely different process in the formation. The economy of those countries, or those regions, they were not linked to each other. They were linked to Europe. In the case of Brazil to Portugal, and the other side to Spain. The other aspect that's very important to understand is that the independence, in the case of Brazil, was a civilian process, followed by a very small war. The war lasted for 9 months or 1 year at most, but not on all parts of Brazil, but just in Bahia that was a big resistance. In the case of South America, the rest of South America, and we have to take apart the case of Guyana and Suriname because the story is a little bit different. They would be more Caribbean in this sense, even though they are part of South America. In the case of the Spanish South America, it was a war that took 14 long years up to the independence. When we had there only independent countries, even though it took a lot of time for the countries to work together, the first meeting of South America presidents took place just in the year 2000. So it took almost 200 years for the presidents of those areas to sit down together and talk about what they have in common. So we had to face from the beginning this kind of separation. And also what happened is that from the formation of the countries, a lot of small frontier problems were inherited. And this created problems that some of them last till today. This also was something that was a big trouble. In the case of Brazil, fortunately, we had a minister of Foreign Affairs. It was the Baron of Rio Branco. This guy, he signed treaties with all the countries in the continent. And this spared us from having border problems. But unfortunately, it didn't happen all over. The other characteristic of South America that I think is very important to note is that we never had a general war in South America. Okay, the last big war that we had in South America was the Guerra do Paraguay, or the War of Paraguay, that was a war of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay against Paraguay. This war that was that ended in 1870 was the last big war. Of course, we had other wars like the war between Bolivia and Paraguay. Afterwards, we have the Pacific War, but nothing on the size of what we had in Europe. In the case of Europe, we had, for instance, the French-Prussian War, the First World War, the Second World War, something that in the end we have 7 million people that died. We didn't have this there. Why I'm pointing to this now? This is a big difference, because in Europe, when you talk about integration, you talk about survival. If you don't have integration, you may have a general conflict. You had this 3 times before. In South America, when you talk about integration, you talk about idealism. You talk about what will be a better system. So it's much more difficult to convince people through idealism than through survival. So this is a main point. The current process of integration has his roots on the 80s. The 80s for our countries in South America was what we called the lost decade. It was a decade that we have a lot of countries that went on default. We had also, it was a decade that the economy did not grow. We had a very in-debt countries at this point. Even Venezuela, that was a country that received a lot of money from its oil in the 70s, went bankruptcy in 1982. Not to talk about the other countries that, in the case of Brazil, we were at this point a net full importer of oil. Now, what happened at this point? Integration was viewed by many of those countries as something that will give them prosperity. The other point is that we had democracy from the 80s till now. So those countries, they will look at integration as a possibility of leaving behind the rivalries of the past. The best example of this is the case of Brazil and Argentina. We had a rivalry that began in the colony. The rivalry was for the control of the river, of the Paraná River, that gave access to the inner part of Brazil. At this point, there were no roads, there was the river. And this fight for the river create a rivalry that lasted for many, many years. But when democracy came, we realized that this was full, and we should end it. And integration was a possibility to begin it. So the cornerstone of the integration in South America was the new relationship of Brazil and Argentina. This was the initial cornerstone. After that, they developed Mercosur in the beginning of the 90s. Mercosur reunited also Uruguay and Paraguay, as you know, in the beginning. Later on, other countries adhered. And Mercosur is different from all other process of integrations that we have in the region, because Mercosur looks like the European Union, or Mercosur trying to replicate the model of European Union, okay? The other process of integrations that we have there, the Unasur or Andean Community or Pacific Alliance, they deal with very specific aspects, but they do not try to replicate the model, okay? They try to replicate portions of the model of the European Union. Mercosur, no. Mercosur, the idea is to replicate the model. Why I'm saying that? Because the two main characteristics is to go very deep in trade and regulating trade and the life in general in the countries. And the second point, improve the standard of living of people. Those two basic aspects are cornerstone of Mercosur. And Mercosur developed very fastly in the 90s, but then, of course, they could not go deeper, especially because I think there is an exhaustion of the model, and I think that this also is something that we can see in Europe at a certain way. But of course, we never went as deep as the European Union, but we went deeper than people really imagine. Mercosur today regulates the lives of people. Just to give you one example, an Argentinian can live in Brazil, can pay the Social Security in Brazil, and then can retire in Argentina. Okay, this happens today. There is you can live in one country, study in the other country. This is today is a reality. This really changed. Of course, as everything that we have down there, nothing is perfect. Nothing is. Everything has a certain caveat. That's true, but the structure is there. Now let's talk a little bit about Unasur and how it appears and why it appeared. As we have Mercosur, and Mercosur existed from 1991, why there was a need to have a Unasur? Unasur is dated from 2008. So why people decided to do Unasur? What's the difference between the two of them, and what's the main characteristic of Unasur? Well, the first thing that we have to understand about Mercosur is that Mercosur appeared initially as the idea that countries would need to open up their economies in the beginning of the 90s. And to open up their economies, it was very difficult to open directly because those countries in Mercosur were closed economies, okay? So the decision was, well, let's first open up the economy for Mercosur countries, and then we open to the rest of the world, okay? And this was done like this. So the basis of the whole system was the economic spirit of opening up the economies. When it comes the year 2000, this spirit, this liberal spirit, was no more so dense. There were other ideas, and there was the aspect that many countries in South America were now ruled by left-wing parties that would have another vision of the world and of the region. So the idea of Unasur first was a political idea, was an idea, as we try to do something on the economic side, let's try now to be very deep on the political side. Let's try now, through the political side, to try to change the reality. Which reality? The reality that comes down from the colony, that our economies are, in reality, linked to the developed world. For instance, Mercosur wishes is to have agreements with developed countries, with the European Union, for instance. This is the wish of Mercosur. But on the energy side, for instance, even if we have in South America 20% of the oil of the world, okay, 20% of the oil of the world lies in South America, in many countries, you don't have enough electric energy. How come, if you have oil, if you have hydroelectric power, how come that you don't have the possibility of having light? Because you export this energy outside of the region. You do not spend the same energy in the region, and then the region buy from outside the region, which is something that doesn't make any sense, economic sense. Okay? So, the main idea, so taking Mercosur and Unasur, Mercosur was a process, I used to say, bottom up, was a process that was dominated by technicians, by people from lower level, that would control the whole system. Mercosur does not have any body for the presidents, for instance. We have a body for the technicians, for the vice ministers, for the ministers, but you don't have a specific body for the presidents. Okay? So it's a kind of bottom-up. Okay? Unasur is the contrary. Unasur is up-down, because the main body of Unasur is the meeting of the presidents. Now, the main problem of Unasur at a certain point was that it was the contrary. There were too much politics. Too much politics. Because everything has to be determined by the presidents, and everything has to have a political sense. This was something that, on a certain way, divided the region. Why? Because the countries, they are different. In South America, at a certain point, we had countries that would be countries that were on the left, countries on the right, and countries on the center. How, if you decided just to go for the politics, you could have all the countries together? It would be impossible. But it was what the countries tried to do. I think that the main problem of Unasur today is exactly this point. They went too much on the politics, and they did not go through on points that all the countries could go together. This is a main problem there. Now, coming back a little bit and trying to talk a little about Mercosur. People don't know what Mercosur means. Mercosur, the territory of Mercosur would count for 72% of the territory of South America. It would mean, for you to have an idea, 3 times the area of the European Union. We have there almost 300 million people the trade of the bloc grew from $5 billion in 1991 to $60 billion in very recently. But what is the main problem in Mercosur? The main problem is that one of the problems is the problem of communication. People don't know what Mercosur is for. We don't know how we can use it. We don't know what it brought us. The second point is that still countries think that they can do alone something that it's better if they can do together. This is not a problem only for Mercosur, it's a problem for Europe. As you see, for instance, on the area of aircraft or cars, if you have less makes, if you have more people working together and more resources on less car factories, for instance, maybe the technology will be more advanced. But you cannot do that here. As in Mercosur, you cannot simply buy from the country that would have let's say, would be more competitive. And here also lies a very important difference between Mercosur and the European Union. I would say the biggest difference. In the case of the European Union, the Europeans consider every country as equal. So the rule that exists for Germany has to be applied by Greece, okay? Even if there are very different countries. In Mercosur, we don't believe this. We think that the rule that applies to Brazil should not be applied by Paraguay, because Paraguay is too small. So it has to have a better rule, or an easier rule to follow. It's interesting that this difference was the main reason for criticism in Mercosur, because people used to say that our process is a process of, let's say, it's an incomplete process. It's not a process that goes to the very end. Why? Because we have too much exceptions, okay? But it's interesting that in the case of Europe, the criticism is exactly the contrary. Is that people say, but how come we would apply to Portugal or Greece the same rules that we apply for Germany or for France, if they are so different countries? How come, for instance, taking the example of Spain, Spain in the last 4 years, they reduced the budget in two-thirds. The budget, the government budget was $60 billion. Today is $21 billion. Imagine this cut, how it impacted in the economic life in Spain. And yet, the European Union is menacing Spain of suspending the funds because they are not complying with the deficit rules. How a country that cut two-thirds of the budget in 4 years can do more or is expected to do more? This is not fair. This is simply not fair. And when it comes to the streets, and when, for instance, if the European Union block the funds that goes to Spain, what people on the streets will think about Europe or about integration? Would they be happy, or would they like to follow the critics of the integration? So this is the rigidity of the European system that was one of the strengths of the system. But in this case, it's not a strength. It's something that doesn't help. So in our case, it was the opposite. The fact that we had 2 weak rules for countries like Paraguay, it was a weakness of our system, but on a certain way is the strength. Why I'm trying to compare? I'm trying to compare because I think that what we have today is a moment of questioning of the integration. And this questioning of integration is very dangerous, I think, because what people is really questioning is not if we should have more or less integration. What people is really questioning is a society that would try to help those that are in need. If this continues to be fair, or if we have to change this kind of mind. In the case of Europe, I see here basically 3 big challenges. The first challenge is the Brexit. How Europe gonna deal with that? What will happen really in the day that the United Kingdom really leaves? What will happen in terms of capitals? What will happen in terms of trade? And what will happen with the persons that went there? Would they still can be there, or would they have to leave the United Kingdom? So this is the first challenge. The second challenge is the euro. The euro, for some, is the main problem in the crisis that we face today, because together in the same euro, we have countries as different as Greece and Germany. The economies are so different. Can they still hold together? What will be now that we have, for instance, when we had just a small crisis on countries like Portugal, Greece, or Spain is something. But when we heard that maybe the Deutsche Bank or the Commerzbank of Germany have a problem, what will be of the system? When the economy in France is not growing as they expected, when we have problems in banks in Italy, how this economy will hold, and what are the challenges that we have? And the third main question is the question of immigration, is the question of the war in Syria, is the question of how to deal with the Islamic world. Yesterday, I saw in the streets of Florence people pray in the middle of the streets, looking at Mecca. I didn't see this before here, and this is new. We have to adapt to this new reality. How Europe will tackle this challenge? How are we going to see this? This is the kind of problems that we have here. And what are the problems that we have down there? We have a lot of problems. First, we have an economic problem. We have a crisis. In the case of Brazil, is the deepest economic crisis ever. Not even in the when we had the Great Depression, we have a so big recession as we have now in Brazil. This recession is coming to an end. We expect next year that we will grow, but this is not a problem only of Brazil. Take Mexico, for instance. that in the beginning of Peña Nieto government, we had the feeling that Mexico will grow a lot and will help the growth of Latin America. He made very important reforms on the oil system, eliminating the monopoly of Pemex. It didn't change anything. The country didn't grow. So we have down there a problem, an economic problem that is not small at all. Together, when we look at the two regions, what I think is that we have today the end of a cycle. The cycle that prompted integration is a cycle that is coming to an end. The cycle that stimulated countries to work together is not the same because the economy is changing. When we began this cycle, industry was the main motor of change. Today, no more. Today are the services and the technology. This is the main motor of economy today. So, integration will come to an end? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think that simply we will have a phase of questioning and adaptation. Why integration not come to an end? Because globalization is inevitable and will not stop. If it will not stop, then integration will not come to an end. On the contrary, integration will have to go deeper. Okay? But how we gonna change this? This is a challenge for the societies to understand the process and to see how to move forward and also to remove the blockages. In the case of Mercosur, what is the main blockage? The main blockage is that we have to have freer markets among countries. We still have many barriers inside the countries, between Brazil and Argentina, between Uruguay and Argentina, between, let's say, you have to work more on that. We did a very good work on the last year on eliminating the barriers between Uruguay and Brazil, for instance. This was very good, but this is not enough. We should do more. So these are the kind of challenges that we have. So one of the things is that we should face this questioning, but trying to go forward as we move now. The second point that I think is very important is the idea that as integration will only go forward, I think that integration of Mercosur in the European Union is something very important. It's something that we have to pursue. I think that we are now at a point that offers were made in the Mercosur European Union agreement, and we have an important meeting this month, and I think that we have to work hard in order to try to finish this agreement till the end of next year. I think this will create a lot of opportunities, and especially, and this is the main thing, we should think of trade, but we should not think only of trade. There is a very important thing that connects Europe and South America, or it's the fact that we in South America, we are in a certain way the sons of Europe in the ideas of human rights, gender politics, democracy. In many, many things, the way we think there are similar to the way the European Union thinks. And this, you will not see this kind of same level of thinking in other regions of the so-called third world. So it's very important to understand this, the possibilities that we have of working together. But still, we have the challenges. How we gonna surpass all the problems that we face today? This is not an easy question, but I think that we have to try to answer. One thing that for me is very important is try to inform more our societies. Because what is the big danger that I see in the world today is that today people begin to think about radical ideas that fortunately were eliminated in the past. And those radical ideas that are in the air everywhere, they could be a terrible menace for our way of living. It's very difficult for you that are very young, that lived in a world today. When you were born, integration was a reality. You never saw a world separated from this reality. But it's very difficult for you to try to understand a world without integration. But you see the problems. You see what should change. But how we gonna deal with that? It's not easy at all. It's not easy at all. But I think that we should discuss this more and more. Because without really an integration and without a system that improves the standard of living of people, we will be living in a very dangerous world. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.